Okay, so today we're on module J4, prepare data for reports. So the task is to prepare data on supplier diversity for reports to stakeholders or regulatory agencies. We're going to start with stakeholders. So stakeholder assessment. It's important to keep stakeholders informed of a company's supplier diversity initiatives. Ensure key performance indicators, otherwise known as KPIs, align to the requirements of internal stakeholders and all documented requirements of external stakeholders and regulatory agencies. Tables are often used to display the requirements and goals along with actual performance by defined time period. This provides a comprehensive assessment that is clear and concise to all stakeholders. So stakeholder theories. A few different theories are around about who a stakeholder is. So traditional input-output model, the company converts inputs of investors, employees, and suppliers into saleable outputs by which customers buy, thereby returning capital to the company. This is known as the resource-based view. Using this model, companies only address issues concerning investors, employees, suppliers, or customers. So that's the traditional way things have been done. Traditional shareholder view. Shareholders or stockholders are the owners of the company, and the company puts their needs first with the goal of increasing value for them. This is the market-based view, also very common. And then the stakeholder view integrates both the resource-based view as well as the market-based view. Recognizes that there are other parties involved and affected by decisions of the company, such as government, political groups, trade associations, unions, communities, and the public at large. Corporate stakeholder then is a party who affects or can be affected by an organization's actions. Very broad look at stakeholders. Other stakeholders, supply management professionals must be able to identify any other people that could be stakeholders. May have an interest in the supplier diversity program, may be affected by the supplier diversity program, or may be able to influence the program. Once all the stakeholders have been identified, the supply management professional must define the best way to communicate with them. So the model below is used to identify and align stakeholder groups with the project objectives or the supplier diversity program. So the first step is to identify the stakeholder groups, which we kind of just went through. Clarify the objectives of the change program or the supplier diversity program. Identify implied changes in processes and determine the necessary behavioral changes to support these changes. Identify the necessary resources to carry out the change program. So that's all in identify stakeholder groups. There. And then the second step is to evaluate importance. So once you've identified the stakeholders, the next thing to do is estimate the impact of each stakeholder group on the project's success. What relevant resources does each stakeholder influence? How does the stakeholder influence these resources? And what authority does the stakeholder have in their influence or over those resources? And we move on to this, once we've evaluated importance, now we want to evaluate relationships with the stakeholders. Assess the relationships between the identified stakeholder groups. Who has positive influence on others? Which individuals or groups tend to be at odds with the group? And which relationships are strong, weak, or just lacking? And then the final step is evaluate levels of alignment and involvement. So determine the stakeholder group's alignment and involvement with the change program. This involves a 4-step process below. You define the outcome of the stakeholder alignment, develop the alignment strategies, implement strategies, and then track results. That's a pretty generic implementation steps. The project teams assigns team members to each stakeholder group. Define all the stakeholders' purpose in the project, which we talked about. Who needs to make it happen? Who needs to let it happen? Who only needs information only? Have strategies for handling all stakeholders been identified? and how do you align the different groups with the change process? Identify stakeholders' contribution to project outcome. Ensures the right relationships are developed and all stakeholders are heard, and avoids unexpected project delays due to dissension. Allows planning of intervention activities to manage roadblocks. Intended use of data. So organizations frequently develop metrics for measuring their progress in implementing diverse supplier initiatives. The results are reported internally, but also may be reported to customers in the community as well as being made available to the general public. All right, so now we're going to shift gears here and go into the definitions of a diverse supplier. So one of the early things you're going to have to do in your supplier diversity program is define what a diverse supplier is to your company. So if you want to go with small business, which is a size definition, a supplier is considered a small business if its size is consistent with the government standards found in the Federal Acquisition Regulations 19.102. Depending on the industry, and this is what's in the FAR, depending on the industry, the qualification for small business is either based on the number of employees or the average annual receipts. In manufacturing, a small business is 500 employees or less. For transportation, agriculture, and construction, which all have a lot of employees, 500,000 to 100 million average annual revenue is a small business. So up to 100 million for these transportation, agriculture, and construction, whereas most everybody else is on employees. Small business disadvantaged, or a small disadvantaged business, otherwise known as an SDB, it qualifies as a small business, and it's also at least 51% owned and controlled by an individual who is characterized as a socially and economically disadvantaged as defined by the federal government. And they can go into the SBA and find out how they're defining that. The owner's net worth is excluding their equity in the business and cannot exceed $750,000. So government definition diverse, the North American Industry Classification System, NAICS, is used by the U.S. government to classify businesses by type, but does not classify businesses small, large, or diverse. So this NAICS is in direct competition with the United Nations UNSPC codes. NAICS is just the U.S. version, and they should probably just drop it and move to the UN codes, but you know, we have to have our own thing. It's very similar. The Small Business Administration develops size standards for each NAICS category. So you can figure out what category your suppliers are in, and then you can go see with SBA whether they're small or large. Non-government definition of diverse. For non-governmental organizations may adopt third-party definitions of diverse suppliers, which is what I would do if I was a non-governmental organization. The NMSDC has defined a minority-controlled enterprise, and when minority principals own at least 30% of the economic equity of the firm, control the enterprise's daily operations, and retain no less than 51% of the voting equity. That's what makes it a diverse supplier for the NMSDC, which is the National Minority Supplier Development Council. So moving beyond the context of the letter of the law to a broader philosophy of diverse suppliers to include in a supplier diversity program is often considered best practice today. You look at a number of these definitions and then you come up with the definition that works for your company. So domestic and international regulatory regulations requirements. U.S. federal requirements. So the U.S. government requirement for supplier diversity are laid out in Subchapter D, Socioeconomic Programs, Part 19. Yeah, they'll ask you a question on that. Subchapter D, Part 19, Small Business Programs of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, or the FAR. Subchapter D, Part 19, just remember that. U.S. federal subcontracting. Companies supplying more than $150,000 annually on an individual contract must have a subcontracting plan that will include diverse suppliers. This is according to the FAR. Some of the requirements for the Federal federal acquisition regulations for a subcontracting plan are: submit the individual subcontracting report, ISR, using an electronic subcontracting reporting system, of course. Submitted semi-annually, remember that, twice a year, March 31st and September 30th. And it's required regardless of whether there's been any activity. So twice a year, you have to submit this ISR, individual subcontract report, whether or not you've had activity. And it's submitted within 30 days after contract completion. So that's just a one-time deal. Submit the summary subcontract report, submitted semi-annually, March 31st and September 30th. So you got an ISR report and you got a summary subcontract report. State and local requirements. Some jurisdictions have supplier diversity reporting requirements that are like the federal government's subcontracting plans and summary reports. Not all. Publicly traded company requirements. Publicly traded companies must keep records to satisfy SOX and other regulations, Sarbanes-Oxley. And international considerations. Companies may be mandated to maintain a certain level of local content by certain countries or pay higher taxes. Brazil as Mexico both do this. So local requirements, since many diverse suppliers are small businesses, they often focus their efforts on marketing at the local or regional level. Often the customer base will dictate local diverse supplier sourcing. And demographics by geographic location also play a role in diverse sourcing. It is best to identify regional certification boards to ensure that supplier diversity program goals are met. So regional certification boards within each country. The supply management organization may be mandated to maintain a certain level of local content. You just have to understand the country's laws. All right. Which of the following elements is not appropriate to include with a performance to plan report to top management? Ethics policy, performance to plan. I don't think ethics would be in there. Headcount would be, certainly. Savings plan would be, and training would be. So it's got to be A. A it is. Ethics policy would not be appropriate to include in a performance to plan. All right, if the supply management organization were trying to determine the response level of its customers in terms of its supplier diversity, which application would be least useful? Application that would be least useful. Response level of its customers in terms of its supplier diversity. Measuring change in internal and external diversity responsiveness. Could be. We're looking at customers, though. Developing a long-term action plan to work with a diverse supplier, maybe. Determining financial impact of costs to diverse suppliers, disadvantaged suppliers. Diverse disadvantaged suppliers. That would probably be in there. And meeting the quarterly cost reduction goals of the organization. All right, so here's a hint. ISM never likes quarterly cost reduction goals, so if you're looking for a least, it's always going to be that one. D it is. All right. Let's go back and pick up the summary. Oh, I guess we're back here. In addition to tracking KPIs and providing feedback to diverse suppliers, organizations frequently develop metrics for measuring their progress implementing diverse supplier initiatives. The U.S. government requirements for supplier diversity are laid out in Subchapter D, Part 19 of the Federal Acquisition Regulation, also known as the FAR. Several organizations have expanded their definition of a diverse supplier to include any group of individuals that have been socially or economically disadvantaged by virtue of being a member of a particular group, not because of lacking of capability. Bottom line, your organization's going to have to define what a diverse supplier is to you. Okay. Now let's go take a look at some questions that we got to do. Exam questions, CPSD, J4. So there's 5. Well, there's only 5, so you can do all 5 of them. Answers are going to be located here in the answer folder. Go find J4. And you want answers to practice questions. All right, next up, we start a new section, K.